The first thing I noticed that Sunday morning was how steady my hands were. That might sound strange, considering what I was about to do. You'd think they would shake. You'd think my knees would feel weak, or my chest would cave in under the weight of it all. But as I buttoned my navy blue dress and looked at myself in the mirror, my hands were calm, too calm. I remember thinking, this is what resolve feels like. The church bells were already ringing when we pulled into the parking lot. That familiar sound, soft but commanding, floated through the open car window like it had every Sunday for the past 18 years. 18 years of sitting in the same pew, 18 years of singing the same hymns, 18 years of letting that building convince the world that my marriage was solid, God-fearing, and whole. My husband, Raymond, reached for my hand as we stepped out of the car. His palm was warm, familiar. I didn't pull away, not yet. You okay? He asked, his voice low, careful. He always used that tone in public. Gentle, concerned, the voice of a man people trusted. I smiled at him, a small one, practiced, I'm fine. The sanctuary smelled like old wood and lemon polish. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the pews in soft blues and reds. People greeted us as we walked down the aisle. Good morning, Sister Elaine. Brother Raymond, good to see you. Hands touched my shoulder. Hugs were exchanged. Compliments floated my way about my dress, my hair, how blessed Raymond and I were to still be standing strong after all these years. I nodded, I smiled, I sat down, and all the while, my heart beat slow and steady, like it already knew something everyone else didn't. If you had asked me a year earlier whether I thought I'd ever expose my husband at church, I would have laughed. Not because I thought he was perfect, but because I believed some things were meant to be handled quietly, privately, with dignity. I was raised that way. You don't air your marriage out in public. You don't embarrass your husband. You pray, you endure, you forgive. That's what I'd been doing for months before that Sunday, praying, enduring, forgiving things that hadn't even been confessed yet. Raymond and I met when I was 26 and tired of half-love. He was charming without trying too hard, the kind of man who opened doors, remembered birthdays, and never raised his voice. When he asked me to marry him, I felt chosen in a way I hadn't before. Our life together wasn't extravagant, but it was steady. He worked as a financial manager for a small firm downtown. I taught second grade at a public school 10 minutes from our house. We had 2 children, Marcus and Leanne, both grown now. Both convinced their parents were the example, marriage. We hosted Bible study on Wednesdays. We volunteered for food drives. Raymond was eventually appointed as a deacon, a role he wore like a tailored suit. Comfortable, respectable, admired. At home, our life moved in gentle routines. Coffee brewed at 6 a.m., toast sometimes burnt because Raymond liked to talk instead of watch the timer. Evenings spent on the couch, the TV murmuring while I graded papers and he scrolled on his phone. Looking back, that phone was always there. In his hand, face, down on the table, silenced at night. At the time, I told myself it was work. The first real crack came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was folding laundry when his phone buzzed on the dresser. He was in the shower. I didn't mean to look. I really didn't, but the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. Saved with a heart. My stomach tightened, but I laughed it off in my head. Probably a coworker, maybe a client. I folded the towels slower than usual. When Raymond came out, steam clinging to his skin, I asked casually, "Who's Angela?" He didn't hesitate. "Oh, she's part of the new accounts team." "Why?" "No reason," I said, stacking the towels neatly. Her name popped up. He smiled, leaned down, kissed my forehead. "You worry too much." And just like that, the moment passed. Or at least it pretended to, but doubt has a way of settling into quiet places. It sat with me at the dinner table. It followed me into bed. It whispered during prayer. Soon there were other little things, late meetings that didn't add up. Sunday afternoons where he suddenly needed space to think. A new cologne, subtle, expensive, not something I'd ever bought him. I didn't confront him, not then. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was Raymond, Deacon Raymond, the man who bowed his head every night and thanked God for our family. Still, something in me began to harden. Not with anger yet, but with awareness. The night I finally knew for sure, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the house silent, staring at proof I could no longer explain away. Messages, pictures, words that didn't belong to me. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how careful he'd been. How he'd built his affair around the same discipline he brought to church leadership. Separate accounts, careful timing. A woman who knew exactly when to stay invisible. I closed the phone and rested my hands on the table. They were shaking then. That was grief, that was loss, but what came after? The decision felt different. I didn't want revenge, I didn't want to ruin him. I wanted truth to stand where lies had been sitting so comfortably. That Sunday morning, as the choir began to sing and Raymond bowed his head beside me, I knew this wouldn't end the way people expected, because what I carried into that church wasn't just evidence. It was a choice, and forgiveness, I was learning, didn't mean silence. Not anymore. After that Sunday, the one where I sat beside my husband with a truth heavy in my purse and a calm I didn't yet understand, I went back to living our life the way I always had. Or at least it looked that way from the outside. I still woke before dawn on weekdays. I still packed my lunch in the same brown paper bag. Still kissed Raymond on the cheek before leaving for school. I still asked about his day. Still nodded when he talked about budgets and clients and meetings that ran late. But inside me, something had shifted, not broken, shifted. There's a difference. I noticed things I'd once brushed past. The way he lingered in front of the mirror, longer than usual. How he started taking calls outside, even when the weather was cold. How his laughter came quicker but didn't reach his eyes. At school, my classroom smelled like crayons and pencil shavings. The children's voices rose and fell in their usual rhythm, questions, giggles, arguments over whose turn it was to pass out papers. I smiled when I needed to. I taught long division and reading comprehension like my world hadn't cracked open. But sometimes, when the room grew quiet and the kids bent over their desks, my mind wandered back to those messages. I miss you already. I hate sneaking around like this. Soon, that word soon haunted me. I wondered what he'd promised her. A separation, a confession. A future where I was reduced to a footnote in his testimony. Raymond didn't change at church. If anything, he became more attentive, more visible. He prayed louder, held my hand tighter during service. People noticed. Sister Elaine, your husband is such a blessing. One woman told me after Bible study, squeezing my arm. I smiled and said, yes, he is. The words tasted strange in my mouth. At home, our children called more often. Marcus wanted advice about his job. Leanne asked if she could visit the following weekend. Raymond answered their questions with warmth, joked like nothing in the world was wrong. Sometimes I watched him from the doorway, this man I'd built a life with, and felt a quiet sorrow, not just for what he'd done, but for how easily he wore his goodness. I didn't confront him right away. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand myself first. Forgiveness had always been taught to me as something you gave quickly, quietly, and completely. No questions, no conditions, no witnesses. But the more I sat with the truth, the more I realized forgiveness without honesty was just another kind of lie. The first time I almost said something was on a Thursday night. We were washing dishes together, another routine. The radio played softly, an old gospel song humming in the background. You've been distant, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Raymond paused, a plate still in his hand. Have I? Yes. He set the plate in the rack carefully, too carefully. Work's been stressful. I nodded. You've said that. He turned to me then, his face open, earnest. Elaine, if something's bothering you, you can tell me. I searched his eyes, wondering how a person could look so sincere while standing on a fault line of deceit. I know, I said finally, I just miss us. He reached for me, pulled me into a hug. I let him. His chest felt solid. His arms felt familiar. And yet, even there, wrapped in the shape of my marriage, I felt alone. That night, I lay awake long after he fell asleep. The ceiling fan turned slowly above us, its soft clicking marking the seconds. I thought about the woman whose name I'd learned to recognize without wanting to. Angela, she wasn't young. That had surprised me at first. She was close to our age, divorced, professional. Someone who understood discretion. Someone who knew exactly who Raymond was. That hurt more than I expected. This wasn't a reckless mistake. This was a choice. Over the next few weeks, I gathered what I needed, not obsessively, not angrily. Just enough to stand on truth when the time came. Dates, messages, patterns, and in between, I prayed. Not the kind of prayer that begs God to change someone else, but the kind that asks for clarity. Show me who I need to be. I whispered more than once. The answer didn't come all at once. It came slowly, in small realizations. I didn't want to shame him. I wanted him to stop hiding. The Sunday before everything changed, Pastor Williams announced that Raymond would be giving a short testimony the following week about faith, commitment, and leadership. I felt something settle into place then, like a puzzle piece finally turning the right way. At dinner that night, Raymond mentioned it casually. Pastor asked me to speak next Sunday. That's nice, I said, passing him the salt. He smiled. I thought you'd be proud. I am, I replied. And I meant something by that I didn't yet fully understand. That week moved slowly. Each day felt heavier than the last. I chose my clothes carefully. I rehearsed conversations that never happened. I asked myself hard questions in the quiet moments. What do I want after this? What does forgiveness really look like? By Saturday night, I knew I wasn't going to confront him privately anymore. That option had passed, not out of spite but out of necessity, because some truths rot when kept in the dark. Sunday morning arrived clear and cool. I dressed in that navy, blue dress again, the one that made me feel grounded. Raymond complimented me as we left the house. You look beautiful, he said. Thank you, I answered. As we drove, he talked about his testimony, about the verses he planned to quote. I listened. I really did. When we pulled into the church parking lot, he took my hand like he always did. And for the first time since I'd known the truth, I squeezed back, not in habit, but in resolve. Because by the end of that service, something was going to be different for both of us. The service began the way it always did. The organ played softly as people settled into their seats. Pages of Bibles rustled. Someone coughed in the back pew. A baby fussed and was quickly carried out by a tired-looking mother. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. I sat beside Raymond, my purse resting on my lap, my spine straight. He leaned over once and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded. I'm here, and I was, fully, completely. The opening hymn washed over the room, voices rising together. I sang, though my voice stayed low. I wasn't saving my strength. I was grounding myself, feeling the wooden pew beneath my fingers, the cool air against my skin, the slow, steady rhythm of my breath. When it came time for testimonies, Pastor Williams stepped forward and spoke warmly about commitment, about walking in truth even when it's uncomfortable. I wondered, not for the first time, how often words like those were spoken without knowing who needed them most. Then he called Raymond's name. Applause filled the sanctuary. People smiled. Some nodded in approval. Raymond stood, straightened his jacket, and leaned down to kiss my cheek. "Pray for me," he whispered. "I will," I said. He walked to the pulpit with the confidence of a man who had practiced being seen. He placed his hands on either side, looked out over the congregation, and smiled. I want to thank God for my wife, he began, gesturing toward me. For her patience, her faith, her strength. A murmur of agreement rippled through the pews. My chest tightened, not in anger, but in a quiet, aching recognition of how easily words can dress themselves as truth. Raymond spoke about marriage as a covenant, about leadership starting at home, about integrity. Each sentence landed heavier than the last, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. As he spoke, I thought about the nights I'd sat alone at the kitchen table, the way my name had been absent from his messages to another woman, the care he'd taken to protect his image. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd passed that stage alone, late at night, when no one could see me cry into a folded dish towel so I wouldn't wake him. What I felt now was clarity. When Raymond finished, the applause was louder than before. Pastor Williams thanked him and invited the congregation to reflect quietly before prayer. There was a pause then, a stillness that stretched longer than usual. I stood. At first, I don't think anyone realized what was happening. Women stand all the time, to adjust children to slip out quietly to grab a tissue. But I didn't move toward the aisle. I turned slightly, facing the front. My legs felt steady. My voice, when it came, surprised even me. "Pastor," I said. He looked at me, confusion flickering across his face. "Yes, Sister Elaine, I'd like to speak." A ripple moved through the room. Heads turned. Raymond looked back at me, his smile faltering just a little. "This isn't customary," Pastor Williams said gently. "I know," I replied, "but neither is living a lie." The words landed, soft, firm. Raymond's face changed then, just enough for me to recognize fear beneath the composure. I stepped into the aisle. Every footstep sounded loud in my ears, though the room was silent. When I reached the front, Pastor Williams stepped aside, concern etched into his expression. I took the microphone. It felt heavier than I expected. "My name is Elaine," I began, though everyone already knew that, "and I've been married to Raymond for 22 years. A few nods, a few smiles. "I love this church," I continued. "It raised my children. It held my hand when my mother passed. It taught me about forgiveness." My eyes found Raymond. He was very still. "But forgiveness," I said slowly, "does not mean pretending." A murmur rose, confused, uneasy. "For months," I went on, "I've known that my husband has been unfaithful to our marriage." Gasps. A hand flew to someone's mouth. I heard my own breath, steady and clear. "I didn't come here today to shame him," I said. "And I didn't come to tell you private details. I came because the same place we speak truth about God should also be a place we speak truth about ourselves." Raymond took a step toward me. "Elaine," he said quietly. I held up a hand. "Please, let me finish." He stopped. I sat in that pew. I continued, week after week, listening to words about integrity while carrying a truth that was breaking me in silence. My voice trembled then, not from fear, but from grief finally allowed to breathe. "I don't believe God asks us to protect lies for the sake of appearances," I said. "And I don't believe healing begins in the dark." The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the lights overhead. "I forgive my husband," I said next. That was the moment everything shifted. Some people looked relieved, others confused. Raymond exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "But," I added, "forgiveness does not mean avoiding consequences. It does not mean continuing as if nothing happened." I turned fully to Raymond then. "You cannot lead others while hiding from yourself." Tears filled his eyes. I didn't look away. "I'm stepping back," I said to the congregation, "from pretending, from protecting an image that costs me my peace." I handed the microphone back to Pastor Williams. My hands were still steady. As I walked back down the aisle, I felt eyes on me, not judging, not approving, just witnessing. I sat down. My heart pounded now, finally catching up. Raymond returned to his seat slowly. He didn't touch me. The service ended in a hush. No one rushed forward. People lingered, unsure of what to say. Outside, sunlight felt brighter than before. The air felt cleaner. Raymond stood beside me near the steps. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" he asked. I met his gaze. "Because I love myself enough to tell the truth." And for the first time, he had no answer. We didn't drive home together. That wasn't planned. It just happened. Raymond stood by the car, his keys in his hand, while people passed us in small, quiet groups. Some avoided our eyes. Others offered careful smiles, the kind meant to acknowledge pain without stepping into it. "I need some time," he said finally, his voice thin, "to think." I nodded. "So do I." He hesitated, like he wanted to say more, then turned and walked toward the parking lot exit. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief, not because I wanted distance, but because for the first time in months, the space between us was honest. I rode home with Leanne. She'd driven in from out of town the night before and sat a few rows back during the service. I hadn't looked at her while I spoke. I couldn't, not then. Now, as we pulled onto the road, the silence inside the car felt heavier than any conversation. Finally, she spoke. "Mom," she said softly, hands tight on the steering wheel. "Is it true?" I stared out the window at the passing trees. Yes, her jaw clenched. How long? A while, she swallowed. And Dad just let you sit through all that, let you stand there alone. I closed my eyes. He didn't know I knew, not until today. She exhaled sharply. I don't even recognize him. Neither did I thought, but I didn't say it. When we got home, the house felt different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. Leanne made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd first seen the messages, and wrapped my hands around the warm mug. "I'm proud of you," she said suddenly. I looked up. "For what?" "For telling the truth," she replied. "For not shrinking." Her words landed gently, but they stayed with me. Raymond didn't come home that night. Or the next. He called once late Monday evening. "I'm staying with my brother," he said. "I don't know what to say yet." "That's all right," I replied. And I meant it. The following days unfolded slowly, painfully, but cleanly. Word traveled fast. Church always has its own quiet network. Some people called to check on me. Others dropped off meals. A few avoided me entirely, unsure how to reconcile the image they'd held with the truth now standing in front of them. Pastor Williams came by on Wednesday evening. He sat on the couch, hat in his hands, eyes tired. "I wish things had been handled differently," he said carefully. "I understand," I replied, "but I don't regret speaking." He nodded. "Neither do I. Raymond has stepped down from leadership for now." I felt something loosen in my chest, not satisfaction, not victory, just balance. That night, alone in my bed, I cried for the first time since Sunday. Not loud, not long, just enough to let the grief move through me. Forgiveness, I was learning, doesn't erase pain. It just gives it somewhere to go. Raymond came home a week later. He stood in the doorway, looking smaller somehow. "Less certain, I ended it," he said with her. I studied his face, searching for something I couldn't name. "Why?" I asked. "Because I was wrong," he said, "and because I finally saw myself." I believed he believed that. "But belief and trust are not the same thing." "I forgave you," I said quietly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to the way things were." He nodded. "I know. We talked that night, really talked. Not about logistics or apologies, but about emptiness, about ego, about how he'd convinced himself he deserved something more without ever asking what it would cost." "I hid behind church," he admitted, voice breaking, "because it made me feel untouchable. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Not because I agreed, but because understanding matters, even when it hurts. I'm willing to go to counseling," he said, "to do the work, even if we don't make it." That was the first honest thing he'd said in a long time. Weeks passed. Counseling sessions were awkward at first. Painful, necessary. Some days I felt strong. Other days I questioned everything. But I never questioned my decision to speak, because the truth, once released, had changed the air around us. No more pretending. No more quiet suffering in sacred spaces. One evening, as we sat across from each other in the therapist's office, Raymond looked at me and said, "I don't expect forgiveness to fix this. I just want to become someone worthy of it." I held his gaze, then start there. Outside, life went on. I returned to my classroom. I laughed with my students. I stood in church again. This time lighter, freer. Some people still whispered. Others smiled with genuine warmth. I didn't mind either. What mattered was this: I no longer carried my pain alone. And for the first time since that first buzzing phone on the dresser, I felt like myself again, not a wife protecting an image, but a woman standing in her own truth. The road ahead was uncertain. Healing rarely offers a map, but I had my voice back, and that, I'd learned, was where everything began. Healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear sign or a sudden feeling of peace. For me, it crept in quietly between counseling appointments in grocery store aisles, during the long pauses at red lights where I used to replay old conversations. Raymond and I settled into a strange new rhythm. We lived in the same house, but not in the same assumptions. Doors were left open now, physically and emotionally. His phone sat face up on the counter. He shared his schedule without me asking. Not because I demanded it, because secrecy no longer served him. Some nights we talked for hours, other nights we said very little. I learned to stop measuring progress by comfort. Growth, I realized, often feels uncomfortable before it feels right. One evening, after a particularly heavy counseling session, Raymond asked, "Do you ever wish you hadn't done it?" Said it out loud like that. I thought about the question carefully. "No," I said. "I wish I hadn't had to." He nodded, accepting the difference. Church felt different too. The first Sunday I returned after everything, I hesitated at the door. My hand rested on the cool metal handle longer than necessary. I could hear the congregation inside laughter chatter, the sound of people being human together. Leanne squeezed my arm. "You don't have to go in," she said. "I know," I replied. Then I opened the door anyway. Some people hugged me tightly. Others offered gentle nods. A few avoided my eyes. I welcomed all of it. Their reactions weren't my responsibility anymore. During service, I listened instead of performing belief. I let the words wash over me without trying to mold myself around them. Afterward, a woman I barely knew approached me near the fellowship hall. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For telling the truth," she replied. It made me feel less alone. That was when I understood something important. My story had already moved beyond me. Raymond remained seated during services, no longer up front. He didn't complain. He didn't explain. He simply showed up, consistently, quietly. At home, our conversations shifted from repair to reflection. I didn't realize how much I needed to be admired. He admitted one night, not loved, admired. I listened, folding laundry. "And what do you need now?" He thought for a moment. "To be honest, even when it costs me." That answer mattered. But honesty, I'd learned, isn't a one-time event. It's a practice. There were still hard days. Days when a song on the radio tightened my chest. Days when a stranger's perfume reminded me of things I didn't want to remember. On those days, I didn't lash out. I didn't retreat into silence. I said, "I'm not okay today." And Raymond learned to listen without defending himself. One afternoon, I met with Pastor Williams at a small cafe near the church. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air as we sat across from each other. "You changed something that day," he said thoughtfully. "I didn't mean to," I replied. "Intent doesn't always determine impact," he said gently. "People are talking more honestly, asking harder questions. That matters." I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth steady me. "So does accountability," he nodded. "Yes, it does." That night, as Raymond and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the houses, he spoke softly. "I don't expect us to be the same," he said. I shook my head. "I don't want us to be." He looked at me then, not with entitlement, not with confidence, but with humility. "I'm grateful you forgave me," he said. I considered my words carefully. I forgave you so I wouldn't be trapped by what you did. The rest we're still building." He accepted that. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different one. Months passed. Slowly, trust began to take tentative steps forward. Not leaps, steps. We laughed again, real laughter, not the kind meant to convince others everything was fine. We cooked together, took long walks, learned how to be present without pretending. And yet, I kept my independence intact. My boundaries clear, because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting who you are. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Raymond said, "You know, when you stood up that day, I saw you differently." I raised an eyebrow. How so? As someone who wouldn't disappear to keep the peace. He said, "And that scared me, but it also showed me what courage looks like." I dried my hands on a towel, considering that courage isn't loud. I said, "It's just honest." That honesty had reshaped my life. I was no longer afraid of uncomfortable truths, no longer convinced that dignity required silence, and in choosing forgiveness, not as surrender but as strength, I reclaimed something precious. My voice, today, when I look back on that Sunday, the quiet before I stood up, the sound of my own voice filling a space I'd once used to hide, I don't feel shame. I feel gratitude, not because betrayal makes us better people. It doesn't. It wounds us in places we didn't know could ache. But because truth, once spoken, gives us our footing back, it reminds us who we are beneath the roles we play for others. Forgiving my husband didn't make me weak. It didn't erase what he did, and it didn't guarantee a perfect ending. What it did was free me from carrying bitterness like a second burden. It allowed me to set boundaries without hatred, to choose dignity without silence, to move forward without losing myself. I learned that forgiveness is not something you give to protect another person's comfort. It's something you choose so your own heart doesn't harden. And I learned something else too. That sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is speak the truth in the very place she was taught to swallow it. If you're listening to this and carrying a secret that's slowly draining you, if you've been protecting an image at the cost of your peace, if you've been told that silence is holiness and endurance is love, I want you to know this. You are allowed to tell the truth. You are allowed to take up space. And you are allowed to forgive on your own terms. Healing doesn't come from pretending nothing happened. It comes from facing what did and choosing who you will be because of it. So let me ask you gently, if you had been sitting where I was that Sunday morning, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have stood up too if this story spoke to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else may need your honesty more than you realize. And if you're walking your own long road toward healing, you don't have to walk it alone. Thank you for listening.